and welcome to Context. I'm Katie Wilson. As the conflict in Ukraine grinds into its third summer, a chilling new chapter unfolds. Night after night, the skies over Kyiv are lit by waves of incoming drones launched from multiple directions in coordinated attacks. In recent weeks, hundreds of unmanned aerial systems have struck from Crimea, the Black Sea and Belarusian airspace. The sheer scale, frequency and reach of these swarms suggest a tactical shift by Moscow. The question now is whether this signals a decisive turn in Russia's battlefield strategy or simply a new way to stretch Ukrainian defences thin. Europe watches nervously as energy infrastructure, air defence grids and civilian centres come under pressure once again. Meanwhile, the Coalition of the Willing will have a new headquarters in Paris. The decision was taken at a virtual meeting of the coalition's leaders, including the French President, the Ukrainian President, the British Prime Minister and other European leaders. And also for the first time with representatives from the United States, including the President's Special Envoy, General Keith Kellogg. Tonight, we assess what these developments mean for the trajectory of the war, what Ukraine's response might be, and whether Western support is changing in tandem with this new air front. Joining me now is Anna Evans, a political analyst in Lisbon, here to help us decode Russia's drone doctrine, its political implications, and what Europe must prepare for next. Thank you for being with us, Anna. Now, how would you describe Russia's current drone strategy compared to earlier phases of the war?
Well, we know that this war has changed the usual modern model of warfare, in the sense that drones are being used very much since the early days of the war as a weapon that is rather cheap, is innovative, that is very hard to combat and defend from, and that can be used massively. So what the Russian Federation is doing is that it is showing very clearly that it uses massive drone attacks to exhaust the defenses of Ukraine, which cannot tackle that kind of massive warfare. But at the time, drones are hitting civilian population, and therefore, in doing so, they are also putting a lot of psychological pressure on residential areas. So it's like a double edge. On the one hand, the drones aim at exhausting systems. On the other hand, they aim at putting political pressure, because if civil society gets exhausted, society will then pressure the government in Ukraine. And so that is not good news for the Ukrainian government. I mean, these constant waves of drone warfare.
So would you say that it's strategic evolution by Russia to step up these drone attacks, or is this shift in tactics desperation to try and wear the Ukrainian people down?
Well, I would say it is both, because we need to remember that last month Ukraine destroyed a number of Russian bombers with a very well designed and carried out attack, which was operated from Russia within itself. And so Russia is, on the one hand, responding to that attack and showing that it can produce masses of, with an industrial capacity that will wear down Ukraine systems and the Ukraine population. And so that is kind of a pressure politics and the pressure attacking strategy. Let's put it this way. It is a bit more of the same, because it is not that different from the early days of the war. But the issue is that it tries to show to both Europeans and the United States that President Putin is not going to give up on Ukraine. I think this is really very clear. You know, the Europeans are constantly saying we are not giving up on Ukraine, but President Putin is showing with these massive, drone attacks that we certainly are not also giving up on Ukraine. So let's see who is in the chicken game, the one that goes back first.
And another thing we can link this step up in recent attacks on Kyiv is Trump's criticism of Putin. They seem to be in response to that. So what does that suggest about not only Russia's interest in peace, but their attitude towards President Trump?
Well, we know that President Trump speaks a lot and often, and more often than other political leaders do, especially through his social networks. And so we always need to carefully distinguish between the gist of his message and what his latest narrative or play seems to be. And so I would say that it is rather clear when we look at the foreign policy of the Russian Federation, it is rather clear that there has been some adjustment. So President Trump started by trying a rapprochement with Russia, by trying what the Biden administration had not tried. The only tactics it had not tried was to be more collaborative and to approach and try and meet some needs of the Russian Federation. However, that strategy did not work. And when President Trump understood that time was passing and the collaborative strategy was not really being effective, then he started to adjust the sails, and we're going back to the older Biden strategy of alignment with Europe and threatening sanctions and threatening equipment, the availability of military equipment to Ukraine and Europe via NATO.
Now, how that is being interpreted in Moscow, as you say, that shift in strategy, a Russian newspaper has said about Trump's latest statements that the American president changes his mind faster than he changes his socks. So that interpretation of that from Moscow, what does that say about Trump's credibility and strength within the Kremlin as a negotiating power?
Well, I suppose that the Russian Federation has very capable advisors, and these capable advisors know very well that President Trump does change his narrative very often, but that does not translate into a change in strategy. We need to really be very careful between what strategy means, which is a long-term, well-designed plan to meet one's interests, in this case, the United States interests as a great power. That is different from, the usual daily near jokes that President Trump likes to make and provocative assessments. So we really need to be very careful when analyzing, and I am sure that the Russian Federation knows exactly where the United States is standing in terms of what is now being prepared in Congress as a legislative package that will foresee more sanctions and also equipment delivery, munitions and other equipment, missiles, for example, and how President Trump is already adjusting his own choices and his own use of powers, executive powers in this sphere to help Ukraine with equipment. And so Russia can see that very clearly, that there is an adjusted trajectory towards a more coercive diplomacy and less collaborative one, which was the first stage of these first 6 months of mandate.
Yes, as you mentioned, Trump has announced that he plans to make a major announcement about the war in Ukraine in the next few days. So what do you think that could be? You've touched on it already, and what impact do you think the announcement could potentially have?
Well, there are some well-guarded secrets and some less well-guarded ones. So we cannot be completely certain if when President Trump mentions he's going to make a big statement, whether he is referring to those issues we already know, for example, sending Patriot missiles to Ukraine or sending other sorts of very advanced equipment. This would be like a very expected thing, but it could be something much less expected than that. A new sort of strategy involving third parties. We really don't know. I cannot speculate on that. Also, because I noted that State Secretary Marco Rubio, when he met the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov yesterday, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that there is a new strategy that he's going to bring to the president, some suggestion that Lavrov made. But Marco Rubio also mentioned that in the discussions with Lavrov, they actually debated on Iran, for example, and Syria. And we know that Russia has very, very intense interests in both Iran and Syria. And so all these third parties can be part of a negotiations package, and that is the part that we actually do not know.
Yes, so it's definitely all eyes on that announcement. And let's turn our attention to Europe. So their efforts to force Putin to negotiate peace, that's new sanctions and more arms for Ukraine. How do you interpret that as a strategy going forward?
Well, I would say that it is not so different from what we have seen previously, because ever since the early days of the war, Europe has always pressed the United States with regard to making advanced weapons available. This has always been this constant duetto, this constant, going back and forth, ping pong between Europe and the US with regard to what kinds of advanced weapon systems should be made available. And there are risks on that, because as we know, if Ukraine uses an advanced weapon and it lands in Russia, then the Russian Federation will have the opportunity to really dissect that weapon and, make the best in terms of information and knowledge. So it's not a very easy choice to make. Furthermore, going back to our initial talk on the drones, it is much cheaper to produce drones, and bear in mind that Ukraine has grown its drone industrial capacity as well. And it is much cheaper to produce drones and send drones and bombs associated with drones than it is to use advanced weapons. And so advanced weapons are really much more expensive. And this is the new model of warfare that the Ukraine war has brought, that the two sides are using less expensive, less costly weapons, i.e. the drones. And so one needs to be cautious here about how much advanced weapon systems will really make that much of a difference in a war that has been going on for 3 years, especially if we compare what 3 years mean in other wars, say, for example, in the Second World War. You know, there's no comparison to territorial advances in these 3 years, which are really very minor.
So as you mentioned, that change in landscape in warfare, do you have the impression that sanctions are having an effect on Russia at all, given that we're seeing increasingly violent responses from Russia on the battlefield and against civilians?
Well, I would say that sanctions always have a limited impact on their targets. And why? Because sanctions assume that the target does not have alternatives, and Russia does have alternatives. Russia is supported both industrially and financially by China. And so Russia sells a lot of fossil fuel to China. China is an avid consumer, and that purchasing helps the Russian government to finance its needs. At the same time, Iran has also helped Russia a lot, for example, in terms of technology, including the drones industry itself. And Russia has also prepared well before the war started in terms of a self-autonomous system in many areas that are critical. And so Russia is very wise to be rather brilliant in terms of how long it can withstand this kind of conflict. And furthermore, notwithstanding all the sanctions, Europe is still buying energy from Russia. And, you know, energy is such a precious element for countries' lives, well-being, prosperity, and industrial goals, that even when there is war, energy is kind of upper in the ladder, so it's even higher in the hierarchy than a conflict, than war is. And so this is why Russia has the capacity to keep going, notwithstanding the European sanctions.
And now my final question to you is, how do you interpret the mood in Moscow and in Kyiv in regards to this ongoing war, which, as you say, is 3 years in, and we're seeing evolving tactics in warfare?
Well, it is always dangerous for a political regime to deal with this kind of exhaustion. You know, a war is something that drains people's minds and energies and lives and industries and economic capacities. And so there is obviously exhaustion on both sides. But again, in the same way that Ukraine is being supported by Europeans and sometimes the Americans. Well, for a long time it was a lot of support from the Americans, and now it's, you know, gaining strength again. But Russia is also being supported by its allies. And so it is not two countries at war. It is rather two, you know, front lines at war, representing two different systems and beliefs, political beliefs and strategic beliefs. And it is very hard to terminate this conflict because of that, because it is not two countries, it is indeed two systems.
Thank you very much, Anna, for all of your insights and for joining us on Context. Now,
Thank you for having me.
that brings this edition of Context to a close. The battle for Ukraine's skies is now as fierce as the one on the ground. As drones define the new phase of warfare, Europe's policy, Ukraine's resilience and Russia's ambitions are all being tested. That's all from Context. I'm Katie Wilson. Thank you for watching.